Hi everybody and welcome back to the videos. So in the last video we saw how to use a loop in Python to repeat an action or a line of code many times. That was a for loop, and a for loop allows us to repeat lines of code many times. We saw how to use it with a list. So we had a list of items and we were able to use the loop to go through each item in the list and perform an action for each item in the list. We use it to print out a greeting to each person, to each coder we had in our list of names. We don't always have lists of names we want to loop over. Sometimes we just want to repeat an action or repeat a line of code maybe 10 times or 100 times or 1,000,000 times. And we can do that in Python as well, also using a for loop. So again, just like we saw in the last video, the keyword for allows us to create a loop. We also need a variable to count or keep track of how many times we've gone through, how many times we've repeated the line of code. So I'm going to use a variable called count. I could call it anything I want, but I want to use it to count how many times I've done something. So I'm going to use a variable called count. And the next keyword then was the in keyword. And then here's what's different to what we had before. If we want to repeat something a certain number of times, we can use the range function. So let's say I want to repeat something 10 times. I can use the range function. So range is a function, just like print is a function or input is a function. Inside the brackets, we specify how many times do we want to repeat an action. And here's what's really interesting. Range is actually going to give us a list. It's going to give us a list of numbers starting at 0 and all the way up to 9. It won't include the number 10 because 0 to 9 is actually a series of 10 numbers. You'll see now in a moment. So if you think of this as returning a list of 10 numbers, then it behaves exactly like we saw in the for loop in the last video. So let's give it a go. What we're going to do is we'll just print the value of count is, and then let's put count variable in there. Okay, so let's save that and run it and see what happens. Don't want to run my local settings, that's for sure. Loop example, and there we go. So the first time the loop ran, the value of the count variable was 0. The second time it ran, the value of the count variable was 1. The third time the loop ran, the value of the count variable was 2. And the 10th and final time that the loop ran, the value of the count variable was 9. So there's 10 numbers here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. It's a special thing in computer science. In computer science, we always start counting from 0. If I wanted to print the number 10 here, I would need to change this to 11. And now we have 10. But now there's 11 numbers here instead of 10. So I'm going to switch it back to 10. A nice round number. And there we go. So if I tell you, as I said, that range is a function that returns a list, starting a list of numbers rather than a list of strings, like we saw in the last video, it gives you a list of numbers starting at 0 and then goes all the way up to this number minus 1. So that's 9. So 10 minus 1 is 9. Aside from that, it behaves just like the list we saw in the last video. But what if I didn't want to start counting from 0? Maybe I want a list starting at maybe 5. I can do that too. I can provide a second piece of data in here. Now, when there's two pieces of data, again separated by a comma, when there's two different pieces of data inside the range function brackets, this is the value where the list of numbers will start. So we're saying I want to start at 5. And this, again, it'll create a list of numbers up to this number -1. So again, 10 minus 1 is 9. So let's run this. What do you think the output should be with that? Five numbers, but this time starting at 5. So we started at number 5 instead of 0, just like we said here. And then we went all the way up to 10 minus 1, which is 9. So that's 5 numbers. So that is how we can repeat a certain line or multiple lines of code. Maybe give another example. Print. Now we have two lines of code inside in the loop. If I run that again, so the first time it ran the loop, the value of count is 5, and it printed hello coders. The second time it ran the loop, the value of count was 6, and it also printed hello coders, and so on. So this is now, so it will repeat again every line that's indented under the for loop. Whereas if I put this back here and run it again, it's only going to run the line hello coders once, because hello coders is not indented, it is not part of the for loop. So it helps to remember that everything that's indented under the for loop, under the word for, is what's called the body of the loop. So the body of the loop in this example is just this line here. But if I indent this print line by 4 characters, the body of this for loop now has 2 lines. It includes both of them. So every time the loop runs, it will execute every line of code inside the body of the loop. Now I don't want it to do that, so I'll just put that there and just give myself a bit of space and run that again, and there we go. So the range function can be used with a for loop to repeat a certain line or multiple lines of code a specific number of times. We typically use a for loop when we know in advance how many times we want to do something. So with this loop here, I know I want to do something 5 times, but I could have made that even simpler, and I could have just put a 5 here, and this also would run 5 times starting from 0. Again, 0 to 4. I didn't really need 5 to 10 in that example. We can use the range function with a for loop to repeat a line or multiple lines of code inside the body of the for loop a specific number of times. Now, as I was saying, we usually use a for loop when we know in advance how many times we want a piece of lines of code to be executed. If we know in advance we want something to run 5 times, then we can use a for loop. If we know in advance that we want to perform an action for each item in a list, like we saw in the last video where we gave a greeting to each coder in our list of coders, we can also use a for loop. But the other common type of loop is used when we do not know in advance how many times we want to repeat the lines of code inside the body of a loop. That's called a while loop. So with a while loop, we typically don't know in advance when we're writing the code just how many times the loop body is going to run. But we'll talk about while loops in the next video. So in the meantime, thanks very much for watching. And again, as I said, I will see you in the next video.